Hi there, welcome back to the HRE 2.0 audio file series. Today we're going to deal with the final unit, which is Unit 5, which is titled Christian Moral Development. And the first topic is freedom and justice. Before I get into that real quickly, I just want to remind you that while this is recorded as one continuous file, by all means feel free to stop as we're going from topic to topic if you want to replay something. If you want to use that to help you answer questions with the research questions, go through the topic notes and kind of line things up that way, that's up to you. Or you can, again, listen to the whole audio file at once. Really, it's up to you how you adapt and use it. Just a quick reminder that you have those options because it's always going to be on the Brightspace page. You're not going to lose it if you decide to listen to parts of it and go back to it. All right? So, freedom and justice is our first topic. And it's kind of the overarching guiding question. How are we or you, the individual, called to live and know, or should live in knowing what Jesus taught us about social justice? What ways does Jesus desire to heal us of our sin? And then you talk about the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, how they relate to justice and love. Again, you get back into this discussion. We touched on this a little earlier in another unit. We talked about natural law, which everything in this world has a purpose shown in its design, its natural form. Being part in completing that design is the supreme good that we're looking for. The natural law instituted by God gives humankind the opportunity to work towards the good in all things. In other words, natural law is us trying to achieve the good by working with everyone and everything in this world within its purpose. That then kind of moves into some other ideas or topical notes that you need to kind of keep in mind, which the first of which, oh, bless me, excuse me, sorry, thank you very much, I apologize for that. Justice, which is the virtue that gives each person his or her due in the distribution of goods, upholding what is fair and equitable. Then it kind of moves on to this idea of principle, which is not the school principal, but a principle, which is a rule or / standard of good behavior. Morality is principles concerning the difference between good and bad, right and wrong. Morality is really we're talking ethics at that point. Your ethics are your understanding of what's right and wrong, and your morals are the actions you take regarding that. Your morality is the shown actions of your understanding of what's right or wrong. We then get into this idea of a social gospel, and that's how to treat each other based on the good news preached by Jesus, emphasis on love, justice, forgiveness, and peace. And then social justice. We touched on those Catholic social teachings earlier on in one of the earlier units. Social justice is like fairness and duty to one another within society. It implies that we are responsible for the well-being of our fellow human beings. Okay, which then kind of spins into distributive justice, which is what society owes to its individual members for the common good, such as the right to basic needs like food, shelter, and education. Contributive justice, what individuals owe to society for the common good, for example, paying taxes. We contribute to social programs that help provide people with access to basic needs, hopefully. Commutative justice, which is what is owed between individuals, so how we deal justly with one another. So social justice is the overarching theme. Distributive justice, contributive justice, and commutative justice fall under those, in the sense that distributive justice is what we as a society owe individuals. Contributive justice is what individuals owe society. And commutative justice is what we owe each other. And when I mean owe, it's in the sense of what we should be trying to do, contribute, etc., to help those less fortunate in those areas. That all comes together under the banner of Catholic social teaching. And then just quickly, the common good refers to all the social conditions that allow us to reach our fulfillment more fully and more easily. In other words, it's the common good is what allows the individual to be the best individual they can be, or try to be the best individual they can be. It's made up of three essential elements: respect for the person, the social well-being, and development of the group itself, peace, uh, i.e. the stability and security of a just order, a specific good that is beneficial to all members of society. In other words, you have to respect the individual. We have to recognize that the social well-being and development of the group, when we're talking about the group, we're talking about all of humanity. And then there needs to be some kind of mechanism for peace, or a way to promote peace amongst people. Okay. Quickly, if you go through the notes, you're going to see a number of bulleted points dealing with, natural law, which we kind of defined already. We then get into this idea of freedom, and just real quickly, I'm going to pull some out that I think kind of highlight what you should be focusing on. God created humans as rational beings, conferring on them the dignity of people who can initiate and control their own actions. And then freedom of will. Freedom is the power rooted in reason and will to act or not to act, to do this or do that, and so to perform deliberate actions on one's own responsibility. By free will, one shapes one's own life. Human freedom is the force for growth and maturity in truth and goodness. It attains its perfection when directed toward God, our beatitude. In other words, freedom and free will is, you have ultimately the choice comes down to you as to what you do or don't do in a given situation. And it's, one shouldn't give that up. Can't give that up. Natural law says we all have it and we can't give it. Now, there are situations in the world where people have been forced to give that up, and we can see how detrimental that is to human development, to society, and to cultures. Okay, it's important that you recognize that when we talk about freedom and free will, in the sense that it's not a license to do whatever we want whenever we want. I know that can be misleading. I'm telling you, you're free, and ultimately you have the choice. But that freedom, in the sense that we're talking about it from a perspective of religion, Christianity, and the freedom we're talking about, it's freedom within the context of what God expects us to do with regards to treating each other the way we'd like to be treated. In other words, the golden rule. And it comes back to that, embedded in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, that freedom is governed by a set of frameworks. And those frameworks, well, some people are going to go, well, then are you truly free if you're working within a framework? It's more freeing to be within that framework than not. And what I mean by that is, it's actually more freeing for an individual to know that there are limits. In other words, a fence line around what you can do. Your freedom is a sandbox, but that sandbox has a boundary line around it. And that boundary line gives you a fairly big area to work within, and it allows you multiple opportunities. But it's actually more freeing to have that boundary line than to not. And I know that's going to sound countercultural. That's going to sound odd, because you'll live in a world where people talk about the fact that, well, freedom is that there is no box, there are no limits. That, in the sense of, when you look at it in a secular way, or people who are successful within business or whatever, all that is they're moving outside of traditional modes of thinking when it comes to doing things. The idea of freedom we're talking about is that larger overarching boundary on all humanity that, comes back to the fact that we're really not free to kill somebody who does something to us or it wrongly does something to us that's wrong, either illegal or social justice. There's the limits. When we talk about natural law and we talk about freedom, is the fact that those are boundary freedoms that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about learning to think outside the box and be creative in the sense of um, science, business, etc. But when we're talking about in our purpose as human beings, that fully realized vocation of us, you know, working within a world that is full of individuals, other human beings, there's a hard and fast boundary line to that freedom, and that boundary line is something we all recognize and respect, whether we talk about it in those terms or not. Uh, you have to recognize that so freedom is exercised in relationships between human beings, and every human person is created in the image of God. We've talked about that, and has the natural right to be recognized as a free and responsible being. Um, all owe to each other this duty of respect. Okay. Uh, this right's got to be recognized and protected by civil authority within the limits of common good and public order. And that's not just the police, but we're talking about the legal system. We're talking about governments in general, not just within the context of a police force or the military. Okay. When you look at the world we live in, um, both the Canadian government and the institution that is the United Nations have kind of established minimum requirements for justice and human rights. The UN has the Declaration on Human Rights. Canada has their Charter of Rights and Freedom. Uh, those, I'm not going to go into specifics there, but those are just examples of institutional bodies recognizing that fundamental freedom and those boundaries to those, that freedom works within. Sorry, again, just trying to scroll through. And that kind of brings us to topic number 2, which is sin. Sin is originally a Babylonian word that means transgression. And in the sense of that term from our Jewish roots and our Jewish ancestry, sin was a transgression against God's law. So when you look at Abraham and Moses and you look at stories in the Old Testament, when they talk about sin, sin is you didn't obey God's commandments. Therefore, God punished you. That's in a nutshell. Now I'm kind of generalizing it and keeping it rather straightforward. But that's in a nutshell. God punished you. God was kind of judge and jury. When we move into the renewal of and this new covenant established with Jesus, we then move into this idea that sin is still not adhering to God's teachings or God's commandments, if you will, God's law. But now Jesus presents us with this image of God that is a much more parental father figure like individual who is forgiving of these mistakes, recognizes that free will, is a double-edged sword, and that you can make mistakes, you can make choices, but those choices aren't or don't merit God's direct interference or God's direct form of any kind of form of punishment. It's now the fact that there's, through the sacraments of healing, specifically confession, that we can atone for our mistakes, and that atonement hopefully wipes the slate clean, or gives us an opportunity to change our behaviors and become better people, and in turn recognize all of the other things we've talked about in the previous units about what we need to do as human beings to treat one another better. Okay. So really, when you look at this idea of sin, St. Paul kind of says that this is kind of interesting. Where sin increased, grace abounded all the more. But to do its work, grace must uncover sin so as to convert our hearts and bestow on us righteousness to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. Um, Sin, in some ways, is an opportunity for us to really recognize what we as individuals should be doing, as opposed to not doing. It's through those kind of mistakes and the fact that it's God's genuine love for us, you know, creates an interesting dynamic between us and God that doesn't, to a degree, exist in other religions. Um, and that's, again, it's really an opportunity for us to see that uh, everybody lives with sin in some way, shape, or form. Nobody's perfect, and I get people do their best to work hard and do the right things all the time. That's I'm not denying that nor taking anything away from that, but we all do make mistakes, intentionally or unintentionally, and those are things that we need to be aware of and work on. It's a way of kind of, you know, self-evaluating ourselves regularly and saying, okay, yes, this really isn't working. This isn't right. We need to change this. And change isn't easy. And sin, I think, is a clarion call to people to make changes in given situations. Um, when you go through the notes, you're going to see some things related to quote unquote sin from the Catechism. The first one's kind of a quick definition. Sin is an offense against reason, truth, and right conscience. It is a failure in genuine love for God and neighbor caused by a perverse attachment to certain goods. It wounds the nature of humans, and injures human solidarity. It has been defined as an utterance, a deed, or a desire contrary to the eternal law. Um, Sin is love of oneself, even to the contempt of God. Uh, just to give you some ideas of how the church words it within the Catechism, um, realize that sin is some kind of disruption between your relationship with yourself, others, and or God. That's really what it comes down to. Okay. Uh, we then get into there are different types of sin. Um, really, just quickly, um, and these are fancy terms. So, like jealousy, anger, selfishness, dissension, envy, drunkenness, those are all examples of sin. Uh, so, really, when we talk about sins, they can be divided into spiritual and carnal sins, or sins in thought, word, deed, or omission. Um, so, spiritual sins are ones against God. Carnal sins involve sins against our neighbor and ourselves, and that can take on various different. It can look very different for individuals. Okay. Um, the two main divisions within what we refer to as sin are mortal and venial sin. Now, these are terms that don't get used very often in the modern church, in the sense that I think it's good to have this history, but you recognize that I think we've tried to recognize that sin is sin, and there needs to be um, course corrections. When people sin, people have to hold themselves accountable to those sins and make changes, or try to make changes, or seek help to make changes. So mortal sin destroys the charity in the heart of humans by a grave violation of God's law. It turns humans away from God. Um, Venial sin allows charity to subsist or exist, to kind of continue, even though it offends and wounds it. Um, So for a sin to be mortal or considered a mortal sin, three conditions together must be met. Mortal sin is sin whose object is grave matter, which is also committed with full knowledge and deliberate consent. Um, Grave matter, then that really refers to the fact that are they in direct contravention of the Ten Commandments? Those are considered mortal sins. Um, when we talk about full knowledge and complete consent, it's the fact that the person committing the sin is doing so with full knowledge of the fact that it's not right. Okay. Um, so feigned ignorance and hardness of heart do not diminish, but rather increase the voluntary character of a sin. So, in other words, um, people who've committed mortal sins and then claim, well, I didn't realize that was a sin, or that, or, you know, I'm that, I'm seeking, or seeking revenge is a good example of a mortal sin, where that may result in the death or injury of another individual. Um, that's, that's a hardness of heart. That doesn't take anything away from that mortal sin. It doesn't lessen that. Unintentional ignorance uh, can diminish what a mortal sin is, but these are gray areas you're kind of moving into when we deal with this. Um, so venial sins is where, in a less serious matter, they do not observe the standard prescribed by moral law, or where they disobey moral law in a grave matter, but without full knowledge or without complete consent. In other words, um, the, an example of a venial sin could be you lie to cover up something a friend did or didn't do to try to lessen the punishment. Um, or you're caught in a situation where you make some promise to someone not to reveal something that's um, potentially dangerous or injurious to that other individual, or they've confessed that they're going to do something that could be sinful, and you're caught between whether you tell somebody or not. That's a venial sin. Venial sins are they're they're lesser sins in the sense that we're not intentionally kind of going out to commit a wrong act, knowing full well that it's wrong. Sometimes we can get caught up in situations where we will do something thinking we're doing or believing we're doing something right and then recognize we're not. That's a venial sin. Okay. Um, and why is it important to understand those differences? Not because the church is going to sit there and you're not going to go to confession, or if you've been to confession, you're not going to have a priest go, that's a mortal sin and da 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 da. It's to understand that if we know what sin is and we know that sin exists because of free will, and it just reminds us of how powerful a gift it is that free will is, but it's also how um, reckless use of free will can be dangerous for us. It can create a whole host of problems, friction in our relationships, and to recognize that God forgives those sins, mortal and venial, and that we have to be cognizant of that, seek that out, and try to better ourselves as we go. Which then kind of brings us to topic number 3, which is stewardship, which is really a Catholic social justice term for um, how do we take care of God's creation. Now, when we talk about God's creation, we'll talk about, excuse me, we're talking about the world we've been given. Um, Not in the sense that we're not also talking about taking care of other people, because that's part of stewardship, but stewardship tends to really lend its focus to uh, the idea that this world was created by God. And because God created this, God left us as stewards. So He left us as caretakers for this world. This land is supposed to benefit everyone, should be equally distributed, should be conserved and restored. Um, Land use planning must consider social and environmental impacts. Land use should be appropriate to land quality. Land should provide a moderate livelihood. The land's workers should be able to become the land's owners. The land's mineral wealth should be shared. Having said that, when you look at the world we live in, yeah, well, you can just turn on the news lately. At the time I'm recording this, um, we're dealing with, the flooding that's happened in Germany and the displacement that's caused, the raging forest fires, the brush fires in California, and the displacement and the destruction that's caused. Um, the ongoing issues of access to clean water in developing nations and on reserves, specifically in Canada and in the U.S. Um, Land conservation, deforestation, animal extinction or endangerment, uh, global warming. The fact that you look at the fact that some parts of the world have had record heat waves, highs for heat, pollution. All of these elements represent um, examples of where we've kind of dropped the ball with stewardship. And you can see where when we talk about stewardship and we're talking about land, inevitably we're going to get back to the economics of things, which then goes back to that Catholic social justice set of teachings we talked about, and the fact that um, we as human beings, sometimes most of the time, it's become a very interesting juggling act for us to try to figure out how to steward this land properly while in turn, maintaining an economy, but creating an economy that is one that is just and accessible to everyone. Which, I mean, we could spend a whole I could spend a whole nother audio file, probably at least an hour's worth, talking about the economics of the world that we live in and how that creates unfairness and creates difficulties. But really, when we focus on land stewardship, um, we need to recognize that we're supposed to take care of this world. If we take care of this world, it will take care of us. And yes, there's been strides made to deal with pollution. There's been strides made to deal with global warming, etc. And all those other elements that I mentioned. There have been strides made in those things. Those strides um, are working. Are they working well enough? Are they working fast enough? Are they? And again, uh, this is not meant to be some kind of doom and gloom thing. It's just the fact that it's a reminder that um, it's the little things that you do. You recycle something instead of throwing it in the trash. That is stewardship. I know it sounds ridiculous to say that's stewardship, but it is stewardship. Um, when you use or reuse something instead of simply either throwing it out or recycling it, there's stewardship. Um, this is not to say that you can't, by all means, become parts of groups that deal with these things, work with these groups, um, find vocations or jobs within these groups, and that's more power to you. What I'm saying is, I don't think people recognize that they're trying to do their part for stewardship when they buy a reusable bag, and that's what they bring to the grocery store every day instead of spending a nickel and buying plastic bags or if you buy plastic bags knowing that those plastic bags when they go home are going to get recycled or you're going to reuse them in some other way, shape, or form. Um, Trying to use your green bin at home for food scraps instead of you know sending those to the dump. That's all stewardship. I don't, and it's interesting because the notes, the research notes in the topic look at these big crises, and we need to look at ways to try to deal with them or help solve them, which is great. I think the little things that we do here at home regularly, or do within, our limited, not our limited scope, but do within our scope, is going to contribute to the lessening of these problems over time. Um, does that mean everybody should own an electric vehicle? No, I think, there's been a fair bit of research done in the internal combustion engine. They're much more efficient. Most vehicles now use a synthetic or semi-synthetic oil, which doesn't require an oil change every 5,000 kilometers. It's like every 16 or 20,000 kilometers, which means we're doing it less often, which means we're creating less waste, hopefully using less. Cars become more fuel efficient. We don't have to use as much gas, so we don't have to take oil and convert it into gasoline as much. All of those things are contributing to our stewardship and trying to lessen the impact of these crisis-like events. Okay. Which then brings us to topic number 4, which is, they refer to it as biblical justice. And really what this is, again, trying to say to you, or point out to you, just as kind of a quick introduction, is that our idea of stewardship, our idea of justice, social justice, so the distributive, commutative examples of justice are rooted in our scriptures, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The fact that, God wants a just world, a world that everybody lives in, that is governed by peace and justice, and where we protect the less fortunate, we take care of those who don't have enough, which, don't get me wrong, we are, as a society, we are doing that. Are we doing it well? Probably not in given situations, but we are making efforts to do that, and that's because it's rooted in our connection with our faith. Okay. When you look at the research, the topic notes, I should say, sorry, the topic notes, not the research questions, the topic notes, you're going to see a number of examples from the Old Testament of references to justice and compassion, and the fact that, God was constantly calling the Israelites to be just with whomever they dealt with themselves, dealt with each other, dealt with people who weren't Jewish. It's interesting. For a group of people historically that have been constantly persecuted, there was this constant reminder of trying to be just in the way they dealt with everybody else, within or outside of their society as well, without, their cultural group. Okay. Those you can kind of go through, but really so biblical justice does not admit to a strict philosophical definition, but in the text themselves is often linked with the qualities such as mercy, steadfast love, and fidelity. The traditional contrast between obligations and charity and obligations and justice is foreign to the Bible. In other words, charity is justice. Justice is charity. Okay. Biblical justice is fundamentally making things right, not simply recognizing or defining individual rights. It is concerned with the right relation of human beings to God and to each other and to the earth. All right. Biblical justice is not blind nor totally impartial. It's partial to those most affected by evil and oppression, symbolized in the Old Testament by 4 groups: widows, orphans, the poor, and strangers in the land, and embodied in the New Testament by Jesus' mission to those on the social and religious margins of society. So in other words, when we talk about the justice system in a secular sense, in a non-religious sense, people say justice is blind. In other words, justice is applied equally to everybody, regardless of race, creed, culture, etc. Biblical justice isn't. Biblical justice says, wait a minute, we're really, we have to we really have to call attention to the fact that there's elements of our society, cultures that are being terrorized, affected by evil and oppression, and we're called to do something about that if we can, or do things that we can to help promote justice and peace. Okay. Um, the idea of those on the margins socially and religiously in society, again, it's sinners, people that you'd look at and go, well, that person's done a lot of wrong. Those people are most in need of some kind of justice from us, from a biblical standpoint. Okay. So justice is revealed in Scripture as God's nature and action. In other words, naturally God imprints this need for justice in each of us because we're made in His image, and it's rooted in everything that God does in the Old Testament. When you look at the way God acts, it's all rooted in that understanding of biblical justice. Um, Justice is symbolized and measured by fidelity to the covenant. In other words, we as individuals exemplify God's justice when we do our best to adhere to the covenant given to us by Jesus. Okay. Prophets rise up to call people to return to God and to remember the demands of justice. In our history, those prophets, they were biblical prophets. We live in a world where it may not be so much a biblical prophet, but you're called to recognize that there are people, whether they be priests, lay people, they may not even be anybody associated with religion, that are calling us to do the right things, calling us to some form of biblical justice, and we got to actively listen to those voices as a reminder to us that that's what we're created to do. That it's innate in the human soul, that essence of God to be just and peaceful and do right things. So Jesus is God's love incarnate and God's justice enacted in the flesh and as the new and everlasting covenant. In other words, people who lived with and experienced the historical figure that is Jesus, saw a living, breathing example of God's justice and God's love. We see that through acts of the Holy Spirit. When the Holy Spirit motivates or creates opportunities for people to listen to the Spirit and to act or take up actions that are just, that are peaceful, that promote those throughout our society. Okay. Justice is the hallmark of our discipleship. Justice is demanded of those who are baptized into the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. In other words, as Catholics, our parents bring us to be baptized and set us on that road. That really is fully realized when you're confirmed, that you become a full participating member of the church after your confirmation, that we as, by extension, of the original disciples, our discipleship requires us to do our best to create that justice and peace. And again, don't mistake the fact that while these are very lofty ideals, that the expectation is each and every one of us is expected to go out and make some kind of groundbreaking contributions to the globe. God expects us all to do the best that we can with the talents that we have to create justice and peace within our own homes, within our families, within our relationships. If we could all do that to one degree or another, by virtue of that, we're going to create opportunities for cultural change, global change. That's the important thing to take away from this. That while these all sound very lofty and they sound like, oh, I don't know if I can do that, all of that, it's each and every one of us recognizes that we have opportunities to promote justice and peace in the things that go on in our daily lives, within our relationships with one another and with ourselves and with God. And that's taking those opportunities creates that. we're meeting that demand of justice from being baptized, that expectation. We're trying to hit that hallmark as best we can of our discipleship to be just. Okay. Sorry, just making sure as I'm scrolling through the topic notes that I'm not missing anything that I'm not, which kind of brings us to, I believe, our final topic within Unit 5, which is topic number 5, which is Catholic social teaching. We've touched on Catholic social justice values. Now we move into quote-unquote Catholic social teaching. And the central message is very simple. It's our faith is profoundly social. We cannot be called truly Catholic unless we hear and heed the Church's call to serve those in need and work for justice and peace. The Church is a sign and a safeguard of the dignity of the human person. Notice that's not limited to just somebody who's quote-unquote baptized. The Church is supposed to safeguard the dignity of every human person on the planet, irregardless of religion, religious institution, belonging, faith. Okay. So you look at in biblical faith, when we look at the Old Testament, the doing of justice is the primary expectation of Yahweh, of God. So for Jews, to be a Jew, God's primary expectation was to work for some kind of justice. So God is active in human history, and these themes of justice come out of that activity. So creation, covenant relationship, community, Anawim, which really refers to widows, orphans, and aliens. The example of Jesus, the lived example of Jesus, is the reign of God and healing. Okay, so in other words, those justice themes come out through scriptures, both in the New Testament and the Old Testament. You then get into like commutative, distributive, and contributive justice, which are, responsibilities of the individual to the individual, which is commutative or community justice. Distribution justice or distributive justice is the responsibility of society to the individual. And contribution or contributive justice is the responsibility of individuals to society. All of those examples there really try to drive home the fact that while we have Catholic social values, we have those values, they come together in this teaching that we have to recognize that, and it's a lot to juggle. I know it sounds mind-boggling when you listen to all of this, and most people do it without even thinking. When you talk about human dignity, it's that basic respect you give to people that you meet, anybody you meet. Your first response in dealing with people is to embrace their humanity and the dignity of a human being, and not, rush to judge or do things. This idea of community and the common good, that we all live in a community and we're all working towards a common good, that there are rights and duties that are expected of each and every one of us that contributes to that community, common good, and human dignity. Those rights and duties also extend to this, preferential option for the poor, which is a phrase that says really the less fortunate in our society are the priority. We then get into this idea of participation. It's not a spectator sport when we talk about Catholic social teaching. We talk about justice. We all have to do something. Again, it doesn't have to be something huge, but we all have to take part in it. Economic justice, which ties into another idea that is down a little lower, and I'm going to deal with now, but the role of government. Um, we're called to recognize that when you're old enough to vote or you're participating in society as in the sense of government, that we should be looking to elect people who are going to take into account the fact that, you know, they should be looking at human dignity, and every time they pass, you know, bills, laws, etc., that deal with human dignity, deal with the community and common good, um, give some kind of option for the poor, preferential option for the poor, um, and in turn create this promotion of peace, instill a sense of stewardship for the creation, and try to bring us together in some form of solidarity. Um, and ultimately it goes back to that economic justice, that are creating a system that is just for people economically. Okay. Um, the next elements are stewardship of creation, which we already talked about, so I'm not going to get into that. Solidarity really is the fact that we are stronger together. And when we recognize we're all human beings called to achieve justice and peace in the world, that has a way of creating that solidarity. All right. And then the last one is promotion of peace, which really is, it's kind of the penultimate goal of everything we've talked about in all of the units up to this point, is that we're ultimately looking to create a world where everybody lives, breathes, works in a peaceful, just environment. Sorry, just kind of, again, scrolling through the notes as I'm doing this. Um, oh, and I apologize. We had, I believe, and this is because I don't count very well. There's one last topic for us to discuss, um, which is Unit 5's topic 6, which is saints. So we've talked about social justice. We've talked about the fact that there's a need for justice and peace. We talked about prophets. Saints for us are lived examples of this, of all that we've talked about leading up to this last topic in Unit 5. Saints literally are there, the witnesses who have preceded us into the kingdom, and we're talking about the kingdom of heaven, especially those whom the church recognizes as saints, share in the living tradition of prayer by the example of their lives, the transmission of their writings, and their prayer today. In other words, saints become exemplars for us. These were sinners who changed their lives and embraced God, embraced that call to justice and peace, embraced Catholic social teachings, and through either their various lived actions, their writings, and their commitment to prayer, they become further exemplars for us. And exemplars in the sense that they're easily relatable in the idea that these were all human beings who were sinners. They were not the nicest, greatest people who then woke up and decided that they were going to embrace their Catholic Christian faith. Um, St. Augustine is a doctor of the church, has written a ton of material about the Trinity, is considered one of the fathers of the early church. Um, as a young man, he was a womanizer. He carried on multiple affairs with multiple different women at the same time. His mother prayed for him every day that somehow he would change his ways. Um, and yet we revere him as a saint now because he did make changes. He realized that there was a better way to live, and he embraced that. The biggest thing for me, I think, is for you to take away from our understanding of saints, Um, yes, on one hand, they are tremendous beacons of what devoted Catholic life is. You have to understand that God doesn't call the best and the brightest. God calls the sinner. God calls the sinner to change, and then through that change, that conversion, through that embracing of faith, they they make contributions to our faith as a whole, our religion as a whole, and those contributions then get recognized, um, usually after their deaths, because they've inadvertently, unintentionally made tremendous impacts on us. And that's the other thing to note. These people did not embrace sainthood or embrace these lives because they were looking at it as, well, this is going to be fantastic. And once I die, I'll be recognized as a saint and I'll live on forever in history and more in immortality. Not at all. These people become exemplars because their lives are, it's a humble embracing of this, and it's that recognition of others. They become signs for others of people of great faith. And it's a reminder to each and every one of us that every sinner has the opportunity to become a saint or to embrace saint-like behavior. That's not to say we're all destined to become saints, but it's doable. It's a reachable goal. It's an attainable goal for human beings to um, better embrace our faith and better promote justice and peace through our religion, through our faith and understanding of it. That's what saints do for us. Um, they become um, this constant reminder in our society that yes, there are people who have taken this on. And I mean, when I mean take this on, I mean the fact that they've embraced their faith and they've embraced it in a way that works for them. When you look at saints, there's no two saints that have the exact same kind of background or origin story that moves them. They're all rather unique in how they embrace elements of Catholic social teaching, embracing elements of social justice or those values. Um, it's them really embracing that relationship with God to a deeper level, and because it's achievable, doable, quantifiable. We've seen it done again and again and again. It gives each and every one of us hope when we sin and we embrace confession that we're hopefully through that process going to make changes to ourselves that are going to bring us closer to more saint-like behavior, if you will. Um, it's it's almost hard to put into words. I know we tend to revere saints as being um, like the Olympic champions of faith, if you will. And I know that's kind of a crude metaphor. Don't take that the wrong way. It's not a competition per se, but we celebrate them as heroes of the faith, and that's great that we do, and it's important that we do. But I also think we need to recognize that those heroes, um, when you look at them, we tend to very much focus on their lives, their saintly lives, as they've embraced their faith and they've embraced it in their methodology and their actions, and we look at that and go, that's great. We tend to ignore, downplay the fact that these were people who, at one point in their lives, had no faith or struggled with it so tremendously that maybe they didn't believe at all. And I think that's something we need to focus on more so in the 21st century world, uh, as a way to give people hope, is the fact that these people started from, I wouldn't even say humble beginnings. It's not like they grew up, all of them grew up, um, they weren't perfect little individuals, and then that perfection is fully realized when they've achieved adulthood, and they then go on to become beatified as a saint. Most of these people, if you look at their histories, you look at them and go, wait a minute here, this person may not be, it really was no better than any other individual on the planet. When you look at God's saving grace and God's parental type attitude towards us with regards to sin, that really we all have saint-like potential in us. We can all become saints, and that's I think that's the root that can draw people, keep people, bring people back to Catholicism. Reignite our kind of our passion for it is recognizing that we're a flawed people. We're not perfect, and it's those flaws that help us uncover that perfection through confession and the sacraments of healing, and can give us the opportunities to reach that saint-like perfection, if you will. And with that, that is it. So that is kind of the last unit. Again, as always, if you have questions or concerns, email me. If it's not clear or it doesn't come through in those questions or concerns, by all means, set up an independent individual Zoom meeting with me, and I can explain things further. And again, remember, you don't have to listen to this whole thing in one shot. You can listen to it in pieces, break it up. That's up to you. And again, that's kind of the end of the units. So good luck with your assignment, and we'll talk soon.